Hello, a chroeso I Oriel Science, and welcome to Oriel Science, Swansea University's brand new science location right in the centre of Swansea itself. This is where the university will be bringing its scientific research and workshops and public engagement projects. It is a very new location, so new as you can see it isn't quite finished, it's a work in progress, but perhaps that's appropriate because we're here to talk about our very own work in progress project, the Creativity Fellowships, which we launched at the end of last year with the artist Peter Matthews and the Swansea scientist Dr Ruth Callaway. It's a collaboration which has been running since last November, and the end point is an exhibition of Peter's work and perhaps some of Ruth's work. We'll be talking about that at the Glyn Vivian gallery at the end of this year. So, as you can hear, we are also very much a work in progress. We're not quite there, which is why I've titled this event Between There and There. But for me, that point in any piece of scientific research or any process of creativity is perhaps one of the most interesting places you can be, when all of the intuitions, the ideas, the thoughts that you've taken into a project, all those questions are being pulled into sharp focus by that endpoint. And I guess that's very much what we're going to be talking about this afternoon, about how this partnership has worked, what has perhaps surprised us through it, and what will be happening next. But before we do, perhaps I should just outline what the Creativity Fellowships are, and then maybe we'll hear a bit about the respective fields and interests that you've both brought into this partnership. So we launched the fellowship programme at the end of last year, and the thinking behind it was quite simply to matchmake artists of all kinds of disciplines with a piece of Swansea University research, with a view to making art inspired from their engagement with that piece of research, but also with a view to, I suppose, broadening the reach of the story of that research, finding new ways to find a new audience for it. So we placed 6 pieces of Swansea University research on a website, put out a public call to artists from across Europe, and I'm pleased to say we got over 400 applications, many of which were for your research, Ruth. Maybe we'll talk a bit about why that might have been the case. But in the end, we selected Peter Matthews, an artist who has spent much of his artistic life working on the shores of the world's oceans, sometimes underneath the world's oceans. So that was the idea behind the fellowships. I'm wondering if I could start with you, Ruth. Could you tell us a bit about the nature of the research that you chose to put forward for this?
Well, I'm a marine ecologist, and my speciality is the animals, all the species that live in and on the sea floor. And that is mostly what we call invertebrates, that are all the little critters, if you like, that live in and on the sea floor. And when we talk about the biodiversity of the sea, often, of course, the way we measure what biodiversity is, and on the whole we say sort of biodiversity is good when there is a lot of species, and it's not so good when there are few. Or if it is going down, we have an impact, we do something to the marine environment, and then biodiversity goes down. And the measure of that biodiversity is often those little critters. And I have been doing a lot of work sort of on biodiversity of the seas, sort of in my home country, in Germany initially, but then also all around the North Sea. I've been involved in a project where we looked at what does trawling, the fishing, our commercial fishing, do to the biodiversity in the North Sea. But then I'm particularly interested also always in the home grounds, you know. So I've done a lot of work on Swansea Bay, which is this hybrid between, on the one hand, being really a stunning environment, but also severely used by dredging, by fishing, by wastewater effluents. And I'm interested in that combination, the impact of our anthropogenic action on biodiversity. And then that is really out at sea. but then also in the intertidal area, so the area that falls dry during low water.
And of course, in Swansea Bay, we have this huge tidal area. I mean, I think
So
it's one of the most significant tidal bay regions in the country. Is that right?
Yeah, it's the second highest tidal range in the world. It's only the Bay of Fundy in Canada has a higher tidal range. But
extraordinary.
And that means that during low water, a lot of the bay, not just in Swansea, all around our coast, falls dry. So particularly the sandy areas, you can walk out, you can essentially walk on the sea floor for a period of time. And you don't need a boat, you don't need grads or cameras, you can just walk out and look at it.
And so Peter, you chose to apply for the fellowship specifically to respond to Ruth's work. What was your own artistic background that you've brought into this partnership? Because it's also, over recent years, it's very much been centred around the sea and seascapes, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So my work going back to 2006, 2007 has been exclusively looking at how to make art within a coastal environment. And that's not to say that I'm interested in traditional maritime subject matter like the picturesqueness of a coastal beach setting or scene. Quite far from that, actually. But what drew me to the fellowship and with Ruth's particular interest and background is indeed that way that she, like myself, have given a big part of our life, I think, to really looking at a quite unique habitat, a quite unique environment, and so my work for about 15 years now has been looking exclusively at what is that relationship with myself and time, the environment, nature, and I was just really fascinated, as you can see in the video we made shortly, in just the shifting dynamics of this location at Swansea Bay, which is quite different to other places which I've worked before. For me, there's a fascinating, over the months of being here, there's a fascinating mystery that I feel at Swansea Bay. It is something altogether metaphysical. The quality of light, the quality of sound, the experience of space and distance and other metaphysical things. And I've been really relishing how these experiences from an artistic point of view can couple themselves with a scientific awareness and understanding of, well, why is that? And so it's been fascinating to combine our different inquiries that exist within a kind of marine environment like this, and to converge them together and see where these exchanges of new ideas, where they go, really.
Well, how did that process start? Because, essentially we sort of put you into this partnership, and you obviously had a shared interest in this kind of an environment. But from there on in, it was really over to both of you in terms of how the process of collaboration would work. So what were the first steps?
Well, I think the first step was, of course, we were just sort of thrown together, and it was clear from the start that Peter said, let's just go out, so in the environment. And that suited me very well. And I think it suited both of us well. And frankly, our first excursions out into Swansea Bay, into the intertidal, you could not have had more miserable weather. It was freezing cold, and it was raining. It was horizontal rain. It was just windy, and all we did was walk out, and we went actually to the Swansea Council building from the University of Swansea Council just to warm up with a cup of tea. And I thought actually, and for me that was the first step was already sort of a bit of a challenge, because you know, if I talk to other, I say, scientists, marine ecologists, I know broadly what they're interested in and what to talk about. But I was talking to Peter, I had no idea what he would be interested in. So I couldn't say, okay, I choose this subject or that. I was just talking, and I thought, okay, I just talk. I talk and talk and talk, and then perhaps he picks something out that he likes. And that was, I think, the start of our conversation. And because, you know, he was very good then at signaling this is what he finds interesting, that not. And many times I thought, that's what he finds interesting, you know. So it was entirely unpredictable for me, and really surprising also to hear. And I think that's how we started talking.
And I think that's how it's evolved naturally. This dialogue between Ruth and I. And
because that conversation has continued to happen in the landscape, hasn't it?
Yes.
And it strikes me that that's especially important for you. I mean, you know, we were just saying now that you're coming here and you've got sand sort of pouring out of every seam, you know. So that physical relationship with the environment of your inquiry, with your subject of inquiry, that does seem to be central to your practice.
Yeah, it's very much central to how I work. I suppose you could boil it down to, you know, that immersion in the landscape. So, you know, in all weathers really. And I just love that kind of being out in the elements, and the directness of observation, the directness of touching and revealing and exploring and discovering. And I mean, I'll be honest with you, a lot of things Ruth said to me from a scientific point of view were interesting to me, but often they went over my head. And that's probably partly because I was so distracted by all of the things in which she was showing to me.
Right.
And I think one of the things that really stays with me now, even when I'm out there on my own, is how Ruth, as a scientist, is able to, how she's able to read Swansea Bay like a book. And I've really found how she physically goes about understanding that knowledge out there, that dynamic ecosystem. And one of the things that I'll always remember, I think, is how she's just able to see something. And for me, it's just a pile of rocks, or, you know, a gathering of mud. But it's always that kind of observation of me watching her, in terms of how she's able to pick it up, reveal it, and show me a completely new perspective of the marine life out there. And that's fascinating for me.
That is fascinating, isn't it? Because traditionally that's the role that we attribute to the artist, who reveals the wonder in the everyday, enables us to see again, or to see with fresh eyes. And yet here it was the scientist sort of, you know, gifting you that experience.
Yeah.
But you did say that those early conversations were full of surprise for you as well. And I can remember talking to you in those early weeks, and you did say that after, you know, so many years of studying in this area, your conversations with Peter had actually changed how you thought about your research. I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so on really on different levels, on quite a few different levels. And so on the highest one, I guess it was immediately this realization of that, you know, talking to Peter and understanding, and I really tried to understand so we have this shared interest, but his direction of looking at the environment is very different. And the way he expresses it, how he translates it into language, the terminology he uses, the whole spirit behind it is different to scientists. And my immediate reaction was, well, we talk always among scientists about science communication, and of course oral science is is what it is about, you know. So how do you communicate science to the next generation, to people who have perhaps an entirely different background? But I thought, well, where is the listening coming in? You know, so is there, you know, so because for me the listening was the hard part, you know. So I couldn't talk to him, he's fine, but you know, to understand. And I was on the highest level thinking, do we perhaps need more of a science listening project rather than just a science communication project? And then really on a more concrete level, of course, immediately it had an impact. So I could see, for instance, that his, I don't say criticism, his observation was that the students, you know, so we analyze everything. Everything has to be objective, has to be quantified. That's what we teach to design experiments. And when we go out, we give them the time to collect material for data collection. But there is very little room for anything else. So if there is not room to explore, to just look around, when really that's what you are doing, you know. So when I go out, of course you see more than just your 3 samples you take. And that affects very much what you're doing. That actually impacts, if you like, the creativity in science, and that you observe something, you come up with new questions, and that's really the creative part in science, is to come up with the right question from observation and seeing something new. So my practice has changed sort of quite specifically on giving students more time in the field. So not to reduce it to taking the samples so that they can do their exercise, but always allowing perhaps a little bit more time, giving them a bit more freedom, you know, not being perhaps quite so specific about the number of samples. And, or, you know, I'm just doing a lecture now on, it's called bivalve stock assessment, to analyze how many bivalves there are in the sea, and how many cockles there are in an estuary, say. And rather than just using the scientific methods, how you do that, I added an element of the cultural heritage of the cockle industry, which has a massive impact on why we do cockle stock assessments in the first place. So that is sort of the more concrete sort of that his work has filtered in, that I pay a much more interest to what at the university we call civic engagement, so how we as scientists or the university in general, how we interact with the world outside the university. And I think that will also carry on in the future. So I feel the whole question, what's the purpose of this all, is much more in the forefront again.
Really interesting. That's great to hear. Well, we've been talking about you both being out in the landscape, and I think that you've made a short video to sort of put your collaboration into context in the landscape. So maybe we should have a look at that now and see you both, you know, at work at the coalface.
Interconnected to how you frame your experience and how you see the world as a scientist, you know.
You see the human beings much more as part of it. So rather than we are us and the environment, but it is integrated. And I think in marine ecology, we try to look at that a little bit more like it, and to have sort of almost the human as another animal, also using that space, is much more holistic you know, sort of to see yourself in this environment,
Yeah.
rather than here is me and there is the environment and there is a distance between the two.
Do I call myself an environmental artist or an environmental advocate? I mean, I suppose, yeah, in some ways I do, but from an artistic point of view, I suppose I'm interested in not creating something beautiful per se, but to experience the beautiful in nature. Looks like the wind and rain are spreading in from out in the open sea.
I think you're right.
Can't see the horizon anymore.
Unit areas,
Okay.
and
Is that so you can do a comparative analysis?
yeah, exactly. So that I can say. So, for instance, what I can do now is I can calculate the coverage. I think maybe have to think whether I want to count them, or perhaps I do like an estimate of the percentage coverage of the suballaria.
Yeah.
That's what it's called, of the suballaria per, so now per quarter of a square meter.
Right.
Then it will immediately, because what I want to get out of this is how patchy it is. So if I take the 2 by 2 meter, then I can say, okay, it is say 50% is covered by this. But what I want to see is, of course, that in some areas it's not, and in some areas it's almost 100%.
Yeah.
And by dividing it, then I get that, you know, I can quantify that, you know, so I can say, okay, that in quadrant 1 there is perhaps 2%, but in quadrant 2 there is already 30% or something like that. And then I can see, so I can sort of try to quantify the patchiness of this, how much is growing, how much is broadly, what is it about.
It's a completely abstract construct from the point of view of the lugworms, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a completely abstract colony of
but
accommodation,
on the other hand,
isn't it?
You have to, you know, it will, of course, it starts with one. You know, there will be one worm first, and then it starts to grow from there. You know, so and it grows out, and then there are, you know, so this area, for instance, they can't really settle.
It's given me an idea actually about drawing, because when I'm drawing in the ocean, I'm actually always moving, and it's a kind of live stream of observation, whereas this is more of a sessile, static observation of something.
Which is, of course, also changing constantly over time.
Right.
But it is
It's intriguing, this underlying organic community of worms with their tubular constructions, and then we have this grid-like man-made frame in which we interpret and analyze the organic creation underneath, you know.
So we saw you there striding out into Swansea Bay, holding, you know, a quadrant which is considerably larger than your normal scientific quadrant. It's actually 2 meters square. And that's because when we started this project, we couldn't anticipate that there would be a third element to the collaboration in the shape of COVID-19. So I was just wondering, could you speak a bit about how the time that you've been working on this collaboration, how that has affected your work and perhaps the work that will be going into the exhibition?
Yeah. So the fellowship started in December last year, and then of course in March time we went into a national what would become a series of lockdowns, unbeknown to us at the time in December. And I remember back in December our first encounter together in the buildings at the university, where I was looking at the scientific paraphernalia and objects and other things that they use in their day-to-day scientific world. And I remember seeing a group of people walking through the corridor of the scientific buildings holding a square, and automatically the artistic eye in me saw that as a kind of sculptural thing, and then I started to know a little bit more about the use of the square being a quadrant, which then I learnt from Ruth that would be used as a sample space to do a kind of survey that could be repeated within an area. But in the video and in the exhibition at the Glyn Vivian, the 2-meter quadrant plays quite a significant, I think, role in the exhibition. And of course it was completely conceptualized by this kind of new contemporary world that we live in now, with this notion and practice of keeping a distance from each other, and so it was quite an interesting idea for me to create a 2-meter square and to actually physically take out into the bay this quadrant made of copper that could be used as a kind of spatial parameter, but also play on this kind of contemporary place that where we are, you know.
Yeah. Now you've called the exhibition Grounded.
Yes.
And it strikes me that's probably also with reference to the period of lockdown.
Yeah.
Is that right? And I mean, especially for someone who works outside so much.
Yeah.
Is that also touching upon your own personal relationship with space and the need for space and feeling sort of grounded in two ways, you know, one positive and one not so positive?
Yeah, so I mean, very briefly, the Grounded title for the show is a kind of double meaning there. Grounded meaning we can't leave home, or the airplanes that are grounded, and but also grounded in the literal sense of the connection with the ground, the earth. Yes, I think it's been a really difficult time for me, as it has for everybody individually. And I mean, I speak for others too, I'm sure, when I say that it's just been really challenging to not have the ability to travel as we did, spontaneously and all that kind of stuff. And it's also really difficult for me to be inside. I mean, I remember from a very early age, I was always found it really anxious to be at school inside, and I always needed to be outside with the big sky overhead. So I think, yeah, it does play on a lot of emotional, psychological, just humanistic things, doesn't it, this time we've been through.
And Ruth, how did this period of lockdown affect you and your work? And I suppose, how did it affect the site of your work, Swansea Bay?
Well, it affected my work in that I'm now working from home, but I can also, we were always allowed to go out. So I could always, in particular areas like Swansea Bay, or also all the estuaries, the beaches around, they are sort of my home turf, and you can be out and about. And what I noticed, that because I tried to go out as much as I could, as I had time to do, so because it was the safest way to be outside, I found that a lot more people would explore an environment that I would hardly ever see people in. So in, say in the estuaries, even going out into the intertidal area of Swansea Bay, not that many people do that. And it may be, of course, I can't quantify that, you know, but just from anecdotal evidence, I would say that a lot more people enjoyed just going out and ventured out. So in a roundabout way, it may have been actually a positive effect in that more people seem to enjoy sort of our local environments.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah. So Peter, I said at the start that, you know, we're not quite there yet. We're approaching the end point of this fellowship, which for you, of course, means that you have to take all of this experience of your conversations with Ruth, your time out in the bay, all of this exterior experience, and you have to bring it indoors into the gallery rooms of the Glyn Vivian. Can you give us some kind of hints or talk us through where your thoughts have led you and what kind of works might we be seeing in the gallery?
Yeah, sure. Well, again, this has been an interesting path for me because most times I'm not sure when I'm making a work where it's going to go. And that's typically how I would work. For example, I could be on the Pacific coast of Chile making something, but I'm not really thinking about, well, where is that work going to? Where is it going to be shown? Whereas for this fellowship, it was quite different, which was inspiring for me and motivating as well. And I remember our first trip to the Glyn Vivian last year, and I started to visualize in my mind how we could use the space. And I think I made it clear in my mind because it's important, I think, to make a decision quite early with which direction you're going to take. That I wanted the exhibition to be a collection of different scaled objects and things. So artworks which are quite small, going into really larger paintings perhaps. And it was also important for me to follow a trajectory where the works were all from different media. And it's very interesting for me actually in reflection today to think about the works that I've made, you know, this far, a few months before the exhibition. And many of the works are completely not what I had in my mind when I applied to the fellowship. And that's perhaps very much about the experience of COVID-19 and how it's played upon my poetic kind of emotional state. The presence here, which is very intense and immersive, and then the absence, and then coming back, and then but collectively the work is very much about trying to conceptually and poetically and materially say something about the ephemeral, transient, poetic, fragile nature of who we are as human beings. And I think Swansea Bay has been a kind of medium, and I don't mean medium in a material sense, but a medium in a kind of spiritual sense, for that to work itself out, you know. So I haven't given myself pressure really to say I'm going to have 6 paintings and 5 sculptures. It's been a very organic experience. And
it's interesting that you should say that Swansea Bay has been a medium but not in a material sense, because you've got a bucket next to you there.
Yes.
Which I think I'm right in saying is full of Swansea Bay clay, is that right?
Yes. So
in that respect, it is going to be literally your medium.
Well, one of the things that has been a really wonderful thing about Swansea Bay for me has been in a material sense, and across Swansea Bay there are patches and areas of clay which is hidden and sometimes partially revealed under a very thin layer of sand. And I kind of, I discovered the clay from our first trip out there into Swansea Bay, and immediately I thought we have to use this medium of clay which is in abundance in Swansea Bay, and it's become a medium now of actually of mixed ideas really. It's been a material which has been reflexive in a way that it helps me to think through this time, and it's been a material that's helped me to heal and recover and just to get grounded again with something real. And it's this notion of being able to touch something and the learning that we associate with touch and the way that we process new things by touching. So clay is definitely a material that we see in the exhibition across various different locations in the galleries, yes.
Am I right in saying as well that having worked with the clay, in some cases you've actually placed it back into the bay, in that you've buried 7 or 8 sculptures at various points around the bay?
Yes, I mean normally I work in a very nomadic way in which the lived experience is central to the creation of the art and the understanding and the knowledge of going through that experience. So yes, there are across Swansea Bay what I call niches or hidden works in progress, and that's commonplace with how I work over the last decade really, where I go out into the wilderness and dig a hole or use the rocks and natural things out there to hide food or clothing or materials, and I'll often go back and actually uncover something the next season and begin the working process. And I don't know how, from a scientific point of view, you might make sense of that, Ruth, but...
Well, I was going to ask you, Ruth, because Peter's also given you some works of art for you to work with or to work on for the exhibition, is that right?
Yeah, it is really. So, but first I want to say, so for me it was interesting that Peter decided, actually from relatively early on, to work in Swansea Bay, because when he came, and of course I immediately think of beautiful seascapes, and I was really keen to show him all the beautiful Gower beaches and the pristine white sands and the white estuaries and the rocky shores. And you know, so he had a look at it, and so he wasn't interested at all. Actually, he wanted to work in Swansea Bay, and he was from the start. So it's not that he wasn't open to it, but he said, no, he felt all the time that his real interest was just here in Swansea Bay. And I sort of get that because I work here, I like working here as well, but of course my perhaps naive sort of image of what an artist wants is of course the pristine landscape there, and not, you know, the steelworks and the harbors and all the sea walls, but that's exactly what he wanted. And so in hindsight now, I think, well, that was just right, because he always said that he wanted to show, or in his work, he wanted that Swansea Bay, as it is today, at this point in time, to show something about that. And that it reminded me of, sort of in science, often the really creative part is not the science itself. So once you know the question, you just go on and do whatever you want to do or have to do to prove, to provide the evidence. But the creative part is to ask the right question, to come up with a different method, to look at it from a different angle. And of course, that's exactly what he did with Swansea Bay. So, you know,
and that's what you will be doing when you work with these artworks, I suppose.
Yeah, well, with,
on the one hand, you'll be dealing with a subject that you've known for years, but from a completely different angle of entry.
absolutely, and I think that evolved sort of a bit over time, because the roles, of course, are quite clear, and that Peter is the artist, and the role was that I would allow him insight into a scientific process and whatever it would take, but that would then influence his artwork. And more we did on occasion just little joint projects, you know. So I was really surprised about his fascination with these quadrats, because for me it was almost like a throwaway side remark that I made at some point, and he really caught on to that and wanted to know, why are you using these unit areas as like a quadrant in the middle of nowhere? And I explained the whole process about sort of unit areas and defining it and statistical analysis and so on. He really ran with it then, and then he came up and showed me his 2-meter quadrant, and I thought it was ingenious, because it was also this reference to our 2-meter distance that we have to keep, and I thought, actually we could do something with that, you know, so we could take it out and I show you how we use it, and we just use for fun, in a way, this 2-meter quadrant, and that's what we are doing there. And it developed from there, and then we said, okay, let's why not, you know, in this exhibition, let's do a joint piece of something. And Peter said, okay, let's do that, you know, just for fun. And then it developed a bit from there. Then he said, oh, if we are doing this, then we could perhaps think about that. And then he came and gave me a little task. He said, I want you to come up with 10 questions, and I want items from this and this. And that's how it developed. And I think, sort of thinking of how, for me, the sort of future work could be, I could see something in that direction, so rather than an artist helping a scientist to portray the scientific work, or a scientist helping an artist to develop an artist. Yeah.
And of course that can never happen, because what you had from the very start was a conversation.
Exactly.
It's a two-way dialogue, and that's, you know, that's certainly what I always hoped, and that's what the Cultural Institute, you know, at Swansea University always hoped, that yes, we would be, to a sense, giving artists this privileged witness, but also providing an opportunity for a new way of looking and seeing for the academic researchers. Now, fortunately, I think in terms of this conversation, I think we've probably filled our time. But thank you so much, both of you. Diolch o galon. I can't wait to see the final works in the exhibition, which opens at the Glyn Vivian, I think, mid-December, is that right?
I think it's 12th of December.
Okay, 12th. So 12th of December, so keep an eye out for that. I said that the conversation has ended here, but actually it's about to continue, because at the end of this, you can join all three of us for a live a session of Q&A on Zoom, when you'll also be able to see all of our faces. So we look forward to seeing you on Zoom in a few minutes. But for now, thank you so much to Ruth and to Peter. Thank you to Oriel Science for lending us their own work in progress. And thank you very much to all of you, diolch yn fawr, for joining us. So, as if by magic, here we are, unmasked and at home. Thank you very much to both of you again for that conversation, and fantastic there to see it there with those various images as well. So this is the part of the session where it's your chance to ask Peter and Ruth any questions that you might have, which you can do either on the chat function or by raising your hand. Or I think there is also the Q&A session. And actually we've got a question that's coming straight away from Sarah Casey. It says, hello, it's a question for Peter. In the film, you mentioned that seeing the worms in the quadrant gave you an idea about drawing. Could you say a bit more about what that idea was? Thank you, Sarah.
Sure. Hiya, Casey. Yeah, Sarah and I know each other from Lancaster University, where we've done a few collaborations with drawing, and so good to see you, Sarah. So I think, yeah, I think for me was the thing about the drawing quadrant, and carrying it from the beach to the sea through the intertidal area, and then suddenly dropping it. And that was kind of a decision where, you know, the dropping of the quadrant was either, in my case, often spontaneous, but often it was also, from Ruth's perspective, delineating a specific area that was perhaps, without the quadrant defining that area of study, quite invisible to myself. And I found that interesting, how an instrument which is totally not connected to the natural habitat of the beach, when introduced and put inside of the beach, would be able to frame something which was ordinarily perhaps invisible. And I think it was that kind of framing, and I suppose it's a little bit like a photographer. You know, photographers like Stephen Shaw or William Eccleston come to mind, where they're able to quite magically, I think, frame the world behind a lens on the camera, and to see again much more clearly, lucidly, what is really there, you know. And I think for me the quadrant was able to do that. It gave me another corridor, another door in which to identify with where I was. So it was quite magical.
We haven't got any other questions coming in as yet, so I've got one to sort of follow up on that, actually, Peter, because obviously in that session we saw how you have, I think for the last few years, you've used drones and drone footage, and even though you quite often work in very isolated places, you're not entirely on your own, because you always have this hovering friend. And I just wondered, seeing those shots, to what extent has that kind of drone footage, that sort of footage from the air, changed your own vision as an artist, especially in terms of space?
Well, I mean, I've started using the drone a few years ago as a way to, I suppose, add another dimension to the kind of way that the experience of a painting can happen, really. Because I'm interested in the kind of narrative of where a painting or an object comes from. And it's often, for me, the actual painting on the wall in an exhibition is actually something which I feel quite detached from, really, because for me it's very much about the process of where it's come from, and that struggle and that lived experience. And I think the drone allows me to do that. But I mean, purely from a perception and observation point of view, I'm often really blown away and surprised with the drone footage, especially on Swansea Bay, because if you walk out into Swansea Bay at low tide, everything on the floor looks quite similar. It's all muddy. It's all monotone or monochrome greys and browns. But if you elevate yourself up through the lens of the drone, you know, it becomes an incredible surface differentiation between different areas of what's happening. And I think Ruth can probably articulate what's happening much clearer than I can. But from a visual point of view, I'm really fascinated, with how that simple technology can give us another angle of where we are. And I think it just makes us feel a much more inclusive part of nature rather than exclusive, you know. And I like that intimacy with that lens-based media.
It was interesting, Ruth, that was something that you mentioned in that film, how you felt that in those seascapes there was more of a sense of the human being integrated with the landscape. And there's a question here from Nigel Thomas, which kind of relates to that, perhaps in your own work. He asks, can you expand on how you are adding an element of cultural history into your lectures?
Okay. Well, the cultural history is really the history, the history and how people in Swansea used the environment. Because if we just venture out now, sort of Peter with his artistic endeavor, I perhaps with a scientific question. But of course, people here in Wales and in Swansea, all around the coast, of course, they used the coast to harvest the shellfish in particular, and fish as well. And so over 100 years ago, so we have, or actually more than that, so that we have evidence that people would, and particularly women, would go out into the estuaries, into the intertidal areas, and collect that shellfish. They developed a whole tradition, a whole history around that. So the men would go out working in the coal mines, women would go and harvest their cockles and mussels. They would then process them on the beach and walk all the way, sometimes really 10, 20 miles to the market. They created a whole community around that. They also had their own income through that. So there was always a level of independence with women around Gower, which also, as somebody once said, perhaps is one of the reasons that they are a bit feistier, perhaps, than elsewhere. And that has then changed, of course. Now, you know, so it's a different industry. It is more industrialized. The ownership is different, but there is still, you go all around sort of the area and you see a link and almost a nostalgia linked to this heritage of collecting, of gathering shellfish all around the coast. And that's just what I meant by that. So if I bring a little bit of that into the lecture.
Thank you. There was a question here from Catherine MacDonald, who says that I teach A-level geography and have to include how artwork can get across a sense of place. And I think this is for Peter, but I'd quite like to address this to Ruth as well. But Peter first, if you had to sum up Swansea's sense of place, what would it be in relation to your work? And also, may she refer to your work in her lessons, please?
Right. How would I sum up Swansea Bay?
Yeah, as a sense of place through engaging with it as an artist, I suppose.
Right. I mean, I think probably the word I would use is change. I mean, that's a word we often use. It's overused perhaps, but I think just the very experience of it constantly changing, and not so much the tidal range of up and down every 6 hours, but I think metaphysically there's something there which I think perhaps, I mean, it's something that I've been really reaching out to capture and work with, is metaphysically the sense of place. And I think it's something in the light and the sound, something purely ephemeral. I mean, I must have seen 100 rainbows across Swansea Bay. And I think it's those metaphysical, scientific things merging together, where in between that you have a purely mystical sense of place, and it's undefinable. And I would go as far as saying it's actually a non-place. It's almost like a heterotopia. It's a place within a place, but it doesn't fit on a map. And it reminds me of Moby Dick, actually. When in the Moby Dick story, it actually quotes that true places are not on any map. And I think it is that kind of, well, where is it? Where am I? Somewhere in this kind of mystical experience, I think.
And does that speak to your own sense of place in terms of Swansea Bay, Ruth? Because obviously for Peter, Swansea Bay is a relatively new friend. For you, it's an old faithful. And I suppose, has this collaboration changed your sense of place?
Well, first I want to say that the way Peter always describes it and how he portrays also his work. I felt that whenever I said that I would work with Peter Matthews and they could see his webpage and the way he works, the videos, this process of working, that I felt that really spoke to people. So obviously he has his drawings and his paintings, and people respond to that. And perhaps some people have seemed to, he told me some stories, some emotional responses to his paintings, and it might bring them closer to the sea. But what I felt is because he allows, sort of additional to his drawings and paintings, he produces these videos and allows sort of as a glimpse into the way he's experiencing the environment. That's what I also meant with him really being part of that environment. And I think he tries to produce this image and does it very well. So with his drone work, with other video work, with photography. And I always had that impression that was what people were responding to very much, you know, so they could relate to that. And for me, that could perhaps also be perhaps an inspiration for somebody to say, okay, I can see what this guy is doing. Perhaps I go out as well. And I would also like to just step out into that environment. It's clearly possible. And that for me is also this, when you talk about the sense of place, and that I would actually like more people to experience, because many of us just stay on the seafront, on the paved area, go for an ice cream at Joe's or do something like that. But it's really not that dangerous to go out, you know, so when there is low tide, you know, there's a little bit of, you know, perhaps it's good to have a tide table, but then it's not dangerous. And to go out, to smell that environment. And for us, so in terms of the teaching, it's perhaps good to know some of the species you see, so that you know it's not just seaweed, but you know a few of the species. You know what a periwinkle is. You can, you know, name some of them. You know some of the history, how they live, so that you just see then other creatures and how they use space, how they use our world, you know. And it's usually people like that, you know. It's a good story.
Well, actually, so much of what you both just said feeds into a few questions, which I'm going to try to sort of bundle together, which are around, I suppose, the potential for this kind of a collaboration to find new audiences, to take both the artistic work and the scientific work out into the community. So Chris Alston was asking about that. But also Kate Mason has asked, how do you plan to take the findings and the legacy of this project to a wider audience, especially with that sense of importance of humans' interconnectedness with nature? Now, obviously, I know that our original plans before COVID came along was to have, you know, several workshops, ideally out in that landscape. So Peter, I guess, could you briefly tell us what you had hoped to do, and maybe what you might like to do once we all can again?
Well, I think that question was from Kate Mason, the director of The Big Draw, who has done some phenomenal things over the years with really just getting communities working with drawing as a main tool, medium for expression and communication. And I would just support that idea. That I think, I think drawing, if we take one art form particularly, is such a powerful way to have a direct experience with the environment. And just to follow on with what Ruth was saying, that Swansea Bay, like all coastlines across the world, are accessible in all weathers, across all seasons. And I think often we forget that. But I think there is a kind of willingness, perhaps, or an openness to also get dirty and to take a little bit of a risk, to go out into the rain and to possibly put down our phone, probably a little bit more, to have that direct experience with things. And I think we often do that by photographing the world now, don't we? And we say, I've been there, I've experienced it because I have a photo. But I think what I've learned from this really is that we learn by doing. We learn by making a mistake. We learn by getting messy. We learn by touching, and all this haptic and the visceral experience is really central to how we can become closer to something. And I think that's probably the missing point in science today, is that through having direct relationships with the environment, with nature, we have empathy, we have compassion, we have emotional responses and stories, and I think that's where we then love and we respect and we take care of the environment. So that's what I would say to that. And I think art and science combining is an incredible force for that to happen.
Which has obviously been the driving idea, behind this partnership. But from your side of things, Ruth, I mean, do you see this kind of a collaboration, this kind of finding a different angle of entry into your work? Do you feel that there's a potential there for what you've been doing for so long to reach a new audience as well?
Oh, absolutely. So I think also what Peter said is absolutely right. And I think it's almost, we had more of that sort of in science and teaching, but it's almost, we've stepped away from it, probably because of technology, probably because many science students, they're not that keen on drawing initially. But when we had some conversations with students where they had done some drawing, they said actually what they had been drawing, sort of be it in the environment, be it particular species, that's absolutely ingrained in their brain. They haven't forgotten that at all. It seemed to be a side aspect of their studies, but now in hindsight, it really taught them something. So I think it's something to reflect, to bring some element of that back into the teaching or the work in general. But I think there are other opportunities of coming from this. So for example, so we are really planning like a citizen science project, and there I think of course the science part by the name will play a role, but I can absolutely see that art can filter into that as well. We can try to use the space. There is more space available for interdisciplinary work to be shown, and I think we can try to show what we've done. But I must say, I also hope that we are, okay, it's just one collaboration. It is between marine biology and a visual artist. But with all you said right at the beginning, there were 6 other projects. And I personally thought they were all awesome projects and very, very different to what we would be doing. And I very much hope that they can be done and realized as well, and just the fact that there are 400 artists applied for this fellowship, to me signals that, there's clearly an appetite for this type of collaboration. And I think so if we had quite a number of them, I think then we can really see what the benefits are of this kind of interdisciplinary work.
Well, I really hope that we can make that happen. I think that you're absolutely right. We're long overdue rolling back some of the unhelpful thinking, perhaps, that C.P. Snow's idea of the 2 cultures, the paths, the separate paths that thinking has led us down. And now, more than ever, as you're saying, we need to get out of silos and to combine. Unfortunately, we're almost out of time. So I thought we'd finish on a nice small question for you, Peter, from Nigel Thomas. Peter, do you see semiotics as part of your representation of your art?
Do I see semiotics as part of my representation? I guess so. I mean, I don't think of the study of signs and how I can use that in my making of art. I don't think of it consciously. But I think, subconsciously I do, yes. I've had some time in China, and last year I went to Japan, and the study of signs, well, what for me are visual signs, because I don't read Japanese, for example. I'm quite fascinated with the visual language that different cultures have to communicate. And I don't think we need to necessarily know what they mean all the time to make something personal out of that experience. I'm very fascinated by how through the intimacy of drawing in the sea, for example, or painting on the coast, where does the mark making come from? Because an idea comes from somewhere, arguably. A mark comes from somewhere, or an action of some kind. So I guess I do think about that in reflection after the experience of being out there alone. There's definitely things out there that I've seen in Swansea Bay that I don't know how to make sense of. There's no way for me to quantify that experience in words or in signs or in language. And I think it just reminds me ever more that painting, drawing, video, film, photography, poetry, it is a language all unto itself, and I guess I don't overthink it really. I just let it kind of come, have the experience, and then do what it does in the world, I quite like the interplay of being ambiguous within that experience.
It's interesting that you should say that, because listening to you and Ruth this evening, and having been fortunate enough to hear your other conversations out in the Bay, so much of what you have been doing over these 8, 9, 10 months has been a process of translation, really, between Ruth's world of language and your world of language, be that visual or linguistic. And I guess what we're moving towards now in terms of this project is sort of a third level of translation, when all of this experience will be translated into 2 of the rooms in the Glyn Vivian gallery. We've touched upon that a bit. The exhibition, Peter's exhibition, or I should say Peter and Ruth's exhibition, because I think you'll be involved in some of the work there, Ruth, as well, is due to open on the 12th of December. So please keep an eye out for that. And that's where you'll have a chance to go along and to engage with everything that Peter and Ruth have been thinking through and working through. I've also been asked to draw your attention to the chat box. The Swansea University Cultural Institute will post a link to all of their upcoming events, which I think we've just done now. And then I think that's about it. So I just want to thank everyone once again. Diolch yn fawr for joining us. Peter will be coming back to Swansea. He will be out there in the Bay working with Ruth. They've both said that you should get out there and experience it as safe as possibly, please. But if you see them out there, do go and say hi, and you might even stumble upon, the odd buried sculpture as well. Anyway, so thank you once again, Peter and Ruth, and thank you to all of you. Stay safe.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.